It's dawn on a late summer's day in northern Greece. We're at the pass of Thermopylae. It's 480 BC. King Leonidas of Sparta calls a war council to break the news to his men that they're surrounded. Thousands of Persian troops are about to crash down upon them. There are only two options: try and flee and perhaps survive, or to make a stand and fight until their inevitable death. Leonidas and his Spartans chose to stay, fight and die. And in doing so, they ensured their names will be recorded in the annals of history, remembered forever. Today I'm joined by ancient historian and Greek warfare expert Roel Konijnendijk, and we're going to go through the Battle of Thermopylae as it happened. Roel, thanks for coming on the show and talking about this most famous of battles. Let's start though, because this is not the first battle between the Persians and Greek forces. Where should we begin this tale? You see, you can't ask a classical historian this. It's too much.
So once upon a time, Cyrus the Great, king of Anshan. So it's a huge problem of how far you have to go back to find the origins of this, right? And this was Herodotus' problem. He was writing the history of this. He didn't know where to start either. He kept going further and further back with earlier causes of conflict between Asia and Europe, or between Persians and Greeks. For us, it's most convenient to start with Darius the Great, who was the predecessor of King Xerxes, who led this great Persian army into Greece. He had already crossed into Europe before.
Okay.
So he had invaded and conquered Thrace and Macedon, which is basically what is now northern Greece and Bulgaria. But then he turned north and invaded Scythia. And so there was always this sense that, Persian expansion had already progressed into the Balkans. The Greek world was already partially under Persian control. And so there was always this sense that, possible further expansion might happen. Greece was always sort of going to be in the path of that.
And also, we should say they have conquered some places in what is now Turkey that we would describe as Greek, because there's Greek settlements there.
Absolutely. So this is what I mean. Like a good share of the Greek world is actually already on Persian control. So you're talking about the cities of Ionia. So that's the coast of what is now sort of Western Turkey, but also on the Black Sea and various other places where there are sort of Greek settlements that are under Persian
So
control.
plenty of Greek people are living under Persian rule.
Living under Persian rule, paying tribute to the great king. And obviously there are several attempts to increase that number, because shortly before these invasions that we like to talk about, shortly before the Persian Wars, there's a great revolt of these Ionians. And they actually get support from various other peoples in the area, the Carians and the Cypriots and other peoples who kind of also join them in trying to shake off the Persian yoke. We can see this as something that sort of stings the Persians. It makes them feel that they ought to do something against these pesky Greeks trying to meddle with their affairs. You can also think of it as just kind of instability on the borders, which obviously needs to be settled in a more permanent way. And so because some of the Greek states from mainland Greece, specifically Athens and Eretria on the island of Euboea, supported the revolt, there is this sense that the rest of the Greek world, or especially mainland Greece, is going to be on the menu of the Persians in some way, either to just stabilize the frontier, or, as the Greeks like to tell it, to avenge what had been done to the Persians in supporting this rebellion.
Right, so we got Xerxes' predecessor, Darius. He decides he's going to punish Athens in particular.
They love to tell this kind of this way of explaining wars. It's basically like personal revenge is enough of a motive, and for them it certainly is. Yeah. But we sort of understand a little bit more about Persian royal ideology. We can bring in some other factors. So for instance, just the drive to conquer in order to prove the legitimacy of kingship, in order to assert the military dominance of the Persians.
It's an old story.
Right, and in fact the Persians maintained this claim, which they had sort of borrowed from the Assyrians, that they ruled the whole world. And so even the mere existence of independent states that were autonomous from that rule was in some way sort of an insult or a threat to the order that they imposed on the world.
So lots of reasons why they would have been interested in making a short hop across the Aegean Sea to Athens, mainland Greece.
Darius has already got this foothold, and it's very easy to imagine that he would be planning to sort of expand it further. Yeah.
He's got northern Greece already. He's now looking at western mainland Greece, Athens. And Athens on the front line. If you look at that map, Athens sticks out. It's on the front line. What does Darius do?
So the first thing he actually does is not to continue from that land base in Thrace and Macedon, but rather to start an island hopping campaign. Essentially, he goes across the Aegean from island to island, which is something they'd already planned before. One of the things that triggered the Ionian revolt is that they had failed to conquer Naxos, and local supporting sort of forces within the Greek world, within Western Asia Minor, thought that the onus was going to be on them to pay for that campaign. That's part of the reason why they rebelled. So you have this situation where the Persians are sort of eyeing across the Aegean and thinking there's a lot of wealthy communities there to seize. And it leads them ultimately to Euboea, first of all, where there's Eretria, one of those states that supported the rebellion, and then after that, Athens.
And they land outside Athens.
Yeah, so first they take Eretria, they punish that city very severely, and then once that's all successfully arranged, they land in northern Attica at this place called Marathon.
And what the Athenians do?
The Athenians march out to meet them. Basically, the full citizen levy that they can muster, they bring it out to confront this Persian invasion force, which leads to the Battle of Marathon, very famously an Athenian victory, which they achieve more or less alone with the sole help of their Plataean allies, as a very small state that exists, that sits nearby, that has an old alliance with the Athenians. So the Athenians very proudly say, we are the first to actually defeat the Persians in battle, which no other Greek had ever done before. And that kind of really changes the narrative around this idea that the Persians are coming.
The Persians go away, but now they're coming back about, 10 years later?
Yeah, so initially there's this understanding the Greeks always have that Darius is going to try again. And there are some sort of movements in the sense of like preparations being made, although it's very fuzzy what happens in that decade between 490 and 480 when Xerxes goes for it. Because what happens in the meantime is that Darius dies. He's on the throne for a long time, he rules for more than 35 years, but when he passes away, his son has to take over. And at that point, first he has to establish his rule, and then afterwards he has to crush various rebellions. So he has to deal with an uprising in Egypt, which is a very difficult place to subject in general for the Persians. It continues to be a thorn in their side. But it takes him a couple of years to set things in order.
Do you think that Xerxes did harbour some kind of desire for revenge, memories of Marathon, or was he just expanding, like you say, because that's what great empires do?
Yeah, so it's very difficult to know. We have no Persian record of any of this, right? So there's no Persian motivation for this. And for the Greeks, obviously, partly this is a story of revenge. But already Greek sources are really sort of willing to consider other factors as well. So they constantly sort of overdetermine why this is happening. They will also say, oh, it's because, he has to prove himself. He's a new king. He has to conquer somewhere. Nobles at his court are kind of like making fun of him because he hasn't achieved any conquest. And of course, there have been earlier attempts by Persian kings to conquer more territory. For instance, towards Ethiopia or into the Central Asian steppes. And so it's not necessarily given that Xerxes would turn against Greece. That seems to be a personal choice that he made on the basis of the most recent expansionist campaigns that his father had waged.
So having made that decision, he chooses to do something different to his father. He's going to go round through the north of Greece. What's going on there?
Well, actually, this is exactly what Darius did initially when he crossed into Europe, right? He took that northern route where it's easy to cross with numerous forces, whereas over the sea, that's a smaller expedition that Darius didn't lead in person. So the Marathon campaign, essentially, was led by his generals, Datis and Artaphernes. So when they cross in person, it seems like these Persian kings always prefer to go across the Hellespont, near where today is Istanbul. Gallipoli is the famous site where they actually do the crossing because around the Chersonese, the channel is very narrow. They build a pontoon bridge and then they can cross the army over that way without having to sort of ferry it in boats.
And the bridge is famously destroyed in a storm and Xerxes has the waves lashed.
Yeah, so this is a story that the Greeks like to tell to show that Xerxes is this hubristic king, right? Wanting to control even natural forces or divine forces. But modern historians have kind of tried to contextualize this a bit more and said maybe this isn't actually what's going on. Maybe he's performing some kind of ritual actually in gratitude towards the water, which was worshipped by the Persians, or some kind of divinity that they perceived to be there. And they were throwing chains into the water as a form of sacrifice rather than as a symbolic subjection of this natural force.
We're also told by these Greek sources that the army was unbelievably massive and drank rivers dry as it passed. What's your sort of best guess about the size of the number of people involved?
Herodotus gives you the numbers and he says there's 2.5 million fighting men. And then he doubles that number to suggest, all the baggage train and all the other people who are attached to these kinds of armies, which is a common feature of ancient warfare, that there's just as many non-combatants as combatants traveling with these armies. But the number is completely unbelievable. Logistically speaking, it would be impossible to feed that many. And Herodotus himself says that. He actually points out when he gets to the final total, he's like, well, I don't know that they could have fed all these people, right? Like, how would you do that? Because that's a bigger concentration of population than exists anywhere in the ancient world. There just isn't any city that big. Even at the height of Rome, there's about 1 million people living in the city. And that requires entire countries to export additional grain to this black hole of a city. We don't believe those numbers, right? We don't think that this is really true, but we have very little to go on when we're trying to establish a more realistic figure. And so what a lot of scholars have tried to do is either to measure what's practically possible in terms of supply, or what a similar space to the Persian Empire, for instance, the Seleucid Empire, might muster when it's trying to pull all of its forces together. And that number tends to be somewhere in the range of maybe 100, 150,000. But this is essentially a guess.
Still, if it was anywhere near that, that's a vast number of people.
It would have been the largest army ever seen. I mean, that's undoubtedly the case. And this is a royal display army, right? He's pulling together all the peoples from all over his empire to kind of show not just places he's passing through and the people he's subjected, like look at how large my forces are, but also the people in that army themselves. They get to see, oh look, there's people from these places that we've never even been to, you know, the four corners of the earth, all together here, and he is in charge of all of it. He has subjected all of these people. You know, what hope do we have to try and reassert ourselves and try to establish our autonomy when all of these people from all these distant places will come down on us if we try? So there is a huge element of sort of imperial display and imperial consolidation that is happening just in the gathering of this army.
So you mentioned the size of the empire there. Can you give me the limits of it at that point?
Actually, the Persians do that themselves. There's a beautiful inscription that's preserved in Persepolis. So it's buried into the foundations of the palace, where they have an inscription in gold and silver, which actually states that Xerxes ruled over this territory that reached from Kush, which is now in Sudan, all the way to essentially the reaches of northern Afghanistan, and from India all the way to the Aegean. They love to list all the peoples that they rule over as a way to establish the sheer vastness of their realm. This is the largest empire that the world had ever seen, and the Persians were very aware of it. They almost had to try and figure out a way to express just how much power they had, because no one before them had ever had any kind of comparable level of control over this vast Middle Eastern territory.
And when you see that embodied and encapsulated in an army, they're not all equipped the same, marching in the same way, fighting the same way. So you'd have Greeks from their Greek holdings, and then what you'd have had sort of light horsemen from Scythia and people fighting, Arab horsemen, all sorts of different ethnicities and ways of fighting.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a bit of a ragtag army in that sense. Obviously, there's loads of different people who are all sort of explicitly described by Herodotus as being dressed up and being made to fight in their own native manner. And the purpose of that, absolutely, is to show diversity, which Herodotus himself finds very interesting and fascinating. He's an ethnographer as much as he is a historian, so he loves to describe this. But there's clearly a propagandistic element in that, right? The Persian king wants to display the variety of the people he rules over. And you see that in the tribute reliefs at Persepolis as well, where everybody's quite distinct in the way they dress and the hats they wear and the kind of gifts that they bring in order to establish these are not all the same people, these are all different people, but I rule over all of them. And so that's a huge element of Persian propaganda, is to show just how different they all are.
What a thing that would have been to see. And by contrast, the Greeks, absolutely not one gigantic global empire, are they?
The Greeks are, I mean, this is not like even the modern nation state of Greece. I mean, these are a number of different small city-states and regions and that are sort of more or less loosely organized. And they're coming out of a period in which their size is increasing. They're growing in wealth and population, but they're still a politically fragmented margin of this huge world that has one giant center, which is the Persian Empire.
So what unites them? They speak the same language?
In this period, they're trying to figure out what it is that makes them Greek, right? And one of the things that really helps them is the Persian Wars, because then they get to think of themselves as being together against this outsider, this enemy, right? So the stories they start to tell about what it is to be Greek kind of emerge from this period. This really starts to form now. And one of the things that Herodotus mentions, he has the Athenians give this speech of these are the things that unite us. The same blood, which is to say the same kinship stories of where they came from. They have the same language and they share common shrines, which is to say there are a couple of sanctuaries that are used by all the Greeks. So Olympia and Delphi and places like that.
So it's the same gods that they worship in those places?
That's slightly different, right? So there's a lot of variation regionally in how the gods are worshipped and which gods in particular are worshipped. They all kind of loosely fit within this pantheon, but there isn't really a code, right? There isn't a sentiment. Greek religion is always the same. Actually, there's a lot of differences. But they do have a couple of shrines where they all get together and agree on what they do there. So for instance, the great Panhellenic sanctuaries where they celebrate the great games, these are things that Greeks can participate in, all Greeks from anywhere, and if you're not Greek, you can't. And that is one of the things that sort of unites them and makes them feel like they're all part of a same shared community.
Speaking of shared community, what are they doing when they hear about this Persian juggernaut that's on the way? When do they hear about it? And is there any form of getting together and kind of come out with a plan?
Yeah, they hear about it early because it takes a long time to put this army together. And we're told that Xerxes actually took years to do it, quite possibly because these troops had to come from all the way, far reaches of Central Asia and wherever else. They hear about it fairly early on, partly from reports that come their way and also spies, which we're told like some of them are captured by Xerxes and he just lets them go and tells them, go home and tell them, I don't want this to be a secret. I'm not trying to surprise you. You can't stop me anyway. They don't have standing armies. They don't have much funding for things like fortification works or anything like that. So there's not that much that they can do in terms of military preparations. What they can do is try to get more and more people to commit to resisting if this invasion comes or when it comes. And so what they're trying to do is sending envoys all over the place saying, will you join us to try and fight this Persian threat? And actually, the number of states that do agree to resist is very, very small. We have a monument from Plataea, which is now in Istanbul, which lists the states that resisted at the Battle of Plataea, and there's 31 of them, out of a total of perhaps as many as 1,000 Greek states around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So you have a very, very small number of states that agree to get together and resist. There's a couple of others that they send messengers to, but in many cases, either they will say, well, we'll see what happens and then I decide, or in other cases, they outright refuse. They don't get the kind of role that they might have wanted for themselves, or because they think the threat is too great, it's not worth it, or because they think they actually stand to benefit more from Persians winning, which is something that's quite common in the Greek world as well.
So you've mentioned Athens already. It's one of the probably sort of leading states. People have heard of Sparta. What are the Spartans' attitude to this coming invasion?
So the Spartans decide to resist, and this is actually kind of a weird one. We don't really know why. The Athenians have a very good reason, which is that they got involved in the Ionian revolt, so they can expect no mercy. So they will resist no matter what. For the Spartans, there's always the option of saying, well, if we just agree to submit to the Persians, then we can probably, have a certain degree of regional autonomy, just like the Greek states in Asia Minor. We can run things the way we want. We just have to pay tribute to the great king, which most people don't find to be too much of an issue, as long as it means that they get left alone. But the Spartans instead decide to resist, and it's probably because they just brook no rival in terms of their own dominance of their own region, which is the Peloponnese, so this peninsula on the very southern end of Greece. And it's very likely that the Spartans simply saw this as an opportunity to assert that they were in charge in the southern part of Greece, and that they weren't going to allow the Persians to take that position from them.
Wow. Is the involvement of the Spartans particularly significant? Are they better at war than the other Greek cities?
So in this period, the Spartans are considered to be the leaders of the Greeks. So they have the hegemonic position, which is to say that they're the most powerful Greek state. And other Greek states essentially are either already in sort of unequal alliances of submission to them to some degree, or they will turn to the Spartans if they need help. So the Spartans are the ones you go to if you want, military backing for whatever it is that is threatening you or that you want to undertake. And so the Spartans have this sort of role of prominence within the Greek world. Now, that seems to be largely just because they're the largest Greek state. They control the southern half of the Peloponnese is just their territory, which make them larger than any other Greek state. And they control, by virtue of all that land that they hold, they have a large citizen body which consists entirely of leisure class citizens, which means they're free to campaign whenever they need to, whereas in other states, most of these militias can't actually leave home for any extended period of time because they have, farms and jobs to get back to.
Because they've conquered their neighbours doing the farming, and the Spartans can concentrate on hanging out and fighting wars.
The farming produce that they rely on is essentially produced for them by an enslaved underclass, the Helots. So these are not really their neighbors, although that's a story that emerges later, that these are people that they have subjected. Actually, it seems like this is just the local population, or rather, this is part of the Spartan population that has fallen into different kinds of dependency, which were eventually sort of formalized into Helot status. So they eventually declare that this is just a permanent situation for all of these people who have fallen into that status. So in Laconia, the Helots are just the same people as the Spartans, except that they are not free and they are forever subject and they are supporting this system. And then they have conquered the Messenians, who are their actual neighbors, which provides them with even more territory from which they can draw produce to support this leisure class population.
So the Spartans make this key decision. They are going to resist the Persians. Why not resist the Persians close to home? Why send their troops further afield? What's going on? What's going through their thoughts?
So actually what the Spartans want is just to protect the Peloponnese. And so they're very heavily invested in protecting the Isthmus of Corinth, which is the neck of land that leads to the Peloponnese, the only thing connecting it to the mainland. They actually want to defend there. But they have allies further north, including Athens, for instance, which is one of the other key partners in this alliance. So it's very difficult for them to just say, well, that's expendable. We'll just withdraw behind this line and you sort things out for yourselves. So what actually happens is they are more or less compelled to protect their allies further north, so both Athens and others, by sending some troops to places where you might stop the Persians. And the places where you might do that are very sort of geographically determined. Any army that invades Greece from the north is going to have to go through a couple of places where you can potentially stop them because it's very narrow terrain, it's very difficult to circumvent. So those are the places where the fighting to stop any such army always happens and has historically happened right down to, the last battle of Thermopylae is 1941. So there's a lot of different occasions when an army was invading. The Romans have done it, the Lucans have done it, the Gauls tried to do it one time. They're all trying to march south into Greece. You stop them at Thermopylae.
So they decide to send a force up to the north to this famous choke point. How many?
This is one of the big problems that we actually have with the narratives. According to Herodotus, it's 300 Spartiates, so full Spartan citizens. According to all the other sources we have, there's 1,000, which means most likely, and this is a very easy solution for us because this is always how Spartan armies work, you send 300 full citizens and then 700 of these perioikoi, who are basically freeborn non-citizens who live in the polis of Lacedaemon, so the further territory of Sparta. So basically they send 1,000 troops north along with contingents of their various subject allies. So the people of the Peloponnese who have been subjected to the Spartans, who are in these kind of arrangements that I mentioned, they are obliged to send troops when the Spartans call the band. So basically when the Spartans decide to march, they get told this many people there at that time and we'll meet you there. And that is essentially how these Spartan alliances work. So these states are also resisting Persia, more or less voluntarily, but they are sort of therefore compelled to send troops along with Leonidas.
Is there anything particular about that number 300 that's important, the 300 free Spartan citizens that went with him?
So there's an interesting thing about the number 300, which is that it commonly recurs in Greek history as the size of a small unit. So if you're picking out a unit of picked troops, for instance, very often it'll be 300. Or if you have a detachment that you want to send on a certain mission, very often they'll choose 300. For the Spartans, it's a little bit more institutionalized. They have a royal guard called the Hippes, the horsemen, for confusing reasons that we don't quite know. But they are 300 picked troops that are meant to be the bodyguards of the kings. The thing is, the 300 that went with Leonidas are not the Hippes. This is not the royal guard that's being sent with him. These are other Spartiates. Because the royal guard appears the year later. They appear for the first time in the historical record as an honor guard for Themistocles. When he's sent as an envoy to Sparta, they send him back with the 300 Hippes. So the Spartans have this royal guard, and they continue to have this royal guard. Later on, they occur a few times in battle narratives. But those are not the 300 that are sent with Leonidas. It's just possible that he got sent with 300 Spartans because that is an already established number for what you send with a king to form the sort of backbone of a military force.
And Leonidas is the king. He's going to be in command of this force.
Sometimes they'll send, generals or other people who are sort of supervising this kind of operation. But in this case, it's one of the two kings. So they have two, which is a very strange arrangement that's very unique to Sparta. They have two kings. An event that Herodotus describes from a few decades ago made them change the law so that it's only ever one king in charge of each army, not both. So you send one king out with an army, and the other one most of the time would then stay home and handle affairs in Sparta. They don't have a lot of executive power, these kings. Aristotle describes them as generals for life. They are most powerful when they're leading an army. When they're at home, they fit within the existing institutions. They don't have a lot of special power. But Leonidas is the one who gets sent to command this army.
Is this a full fat Spartan army? Do you have a sense that they're sending the smallest number of people they can get away with just to show willing to their coalition?
And the big problem is that they send 1,000, but the year that follows, when there's the big battle of Plataea, which decides the outcome of the Persian invasion, there's 10,000 Spartans in the field, right? And that's just the hoplites. So there's many, many more helots who are fighting as light armed troops. So they are capable of sending far larger armies. And the question is, why did they send so few? Now, the ancient sources already have two different explanations for this. One of them, which is the one that the Spartans seem to have preferred, was that they'd received an oracle that said that when the Persians invaded, they would have to sacrifice a king to save the rest of Sparta and Greece. So if they could just sort of send a small force that would inevitably die, that knew it was going to die, then that would allow them to fulfill the prophecy and save the rest of Greece. And so they sent a small force because they knew these men were going to die. The big problem with that is, why would you send 1,000? Why not 10? Why not just Leonidas by himself? Just have him commit suicide by Persian, and then we can fulfill our prophecy. This is the explanation that the Spartans went for, is that this was in order to meet the demands of this prophecy. Herodotus kind of knows that story, but he doesn't really accept it. He doesn't think that that makes sense. So what he proposes is that this is an advance guard, that the Spartans were prevented by a religious festival from sending their whole army, along with the rest of the Peloponnese also having to sort of meet the requirements of this religious festival. So they were under a taboo. They could not march out in force. So they send a very, very small force ahead in order to hold the position, to secure Thermopylae, and wait for the rest of the army to arrive. And then when Leonidas realizes the Persians are already there, they're coming now, they need the reinforcements, he sends a call home to say, can you please send the rest of the army? But at that point, the Spartans have to say, sorry, can't help you, it's the Carnea. The problem with that, as Hans van Wees and modern scholarship has pointed out, is that chronologically, when they actually set out for Thermopylae, this sacred month hasn't started yet. So they could have sent the whole army. They just didn't. They chose not to. And the obvious explanation for that is, as I said, the Spartans are very focused on protecting the Peloponnese, but everything north of that is sticking their neck out. They don't really like to do that. They don't really like to actually commit full forces north of the isthmus until they absolutely have to. And so it seems very likely that what they actually did was just send a minimal force that was considered perhaps enough to hold the pass for a while, but that didn't represent a commitment of serious quantities of Spartan manpower.
It sounds a little bit familiar with British trips across the Channel. You're happy to sort of lead the coalition and support, but you sort of slightly hope that other people, the Austrians, are going to show up and do most of the fighting.
5 divisions of the BF.
Yeah, exactly. So the Spartans marched that forth. They're the sort of heart of the force. They've got their Peloponnesian allies. Other contingents joining them. So how many troops do you think the Greeks end up with at the pass?
We are told that there's about 4,000 Peloponnesians, which makes sense. I mean, if you count 1,000 Spartans and you add up all the little communities sending similarly small contingents, and then you get together with about 4,000 Peloponnesians, who are then joined by people who are sort of local to the region and who are more sort of invested in the defense of this area. So the Thebans, the Locrians and the Phocians, the regions that are immediately behind the pass, they are committing larger numbers, but they're not exactly numbered for us. So the total is usually estimated around 6,000 or 7,000 hoplites and then an unknown number of light troops in support.
To illustrate those numbers, we've got an experiment here that the History Hit team have prepared. There's our plates, and we have got 6,000 grains of rice to represent the Greek allied army.
Magnificent.
So if you want to pour those heroic Greeks out, I will pour out 90,000 grains of rice. Now, these have been individually counted by Giles at Team History Hit. Look at this. You know what, when you show it like this, it does give you a sense. Wow.
Spread this out a bit. Make it look more intimidating. Yeah, I feel slightly outclassed. They're scattering.
So that is a big disparity of troops, isn't it? So we've got the Greeks there and we've got the Persian forces there. But it demonstrates how important that defensive geography is, that narrow pass. Okay, let's get rid of these. That was a very good experiment. Back to the story. So, badly outnumbered, but the geography couldn't have been better for defence.
So this is the thing about Thermopylae, is right, that it's an ideal defensive position because basically there's a mountain that reaches right down to the sea almost, with a very narrow path between the slope and the water. And that is where you can very easily just block off any advance. The road leads right along, it weaves along the edge of that mountain between the mountain and the sea. Now this plain, the sea has receded several kilometers, so it's kind of hard to visualize when you're on the site. But that would have been a very narrow path, a very narrow road. Even before the Spartans had to do this particular operation at Thermopylae, the Phocians themselves, who were local to the region, had fortified this position. They had built a wall across it, and they made sure that only whoever they approved of could pass into Phocis from the north. What the Spartans and their allies do when they arrive is they rebuild that wall in order to fortify that position and make sure that it's completely impassable from armies approaching from the north.
Okay, Roel, here we are. We've arrived on the battlefield. The Persians have arrived from the north, from the west. They've curved around through northern Greece. All opposition just evaporating in front of them. So far very successful, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Everybody they've encountered so far has offered no resistance whatsoever.
Who would? Biggest army ever assembled. Terrifying. They've arrived at the pass, they find a wall, and they find the Greeks manning that wall. What happens next?
So the Persians actually wait. They spend 4 days essentially just looking at that position. And according to Herodotus, this is because Xerxes, in his arrogance, this is very much the Herodotean Xerxes, who's very arrogant. You know, he believes that the whole world will bend to his will, which is so far as seems to be fairly accurate. So he expects them to just sort of melt away. But it doesn't happen. Instead, he has to sort of send various messengers, and there are deserters from his army that reach the Greeks. So there's some interaction, there's some messages being sent back and forth. Mostly later sources that tell us about this because they recognize the ideal narrative tension of this situation. But the Persians are waiting. And what seems to be the case is they're waiting for their fleet to catch up. The Allied fleet has also been dispatched to protect the narrow sea lane that exists alongside this pass. And the reason for that is obviously that the Persians have brought not just their army, but a massive fleet as well. And if that fleet has free reign to operate where it wants, then any position on the coast is very easily outflanked. You can just land troops behind it.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a naval component to this, which is very, very important. And in order for this operation to work, the Persians have to coordinate fleet and army in order to attack at the same time and to try and dislodge both of these forces on land and on sea. And so they're kind of waiting for their fleet to get into position. They seem to be waiting for part of that fleet to circle around Euboea and appear in the Greek rear, but that part of the fleet is destroyed in a storm, which means that what they're waiting for doesn't materialize, which means after 4 days, they just have to get into it anyway.
So obviously you've got scale on one side, you've got geography on the other. What about the man for man in terms of the way people are equipped, trained, motivated? What's your sense of the balance here?
So the Greeks, at this point, they're basically only counting their hoplites, right? They have a lot of light armed troops in support, but they barely count to these elite authors. I mean, they envision the fighting man, the free citizen who is called up by a city to fight, will equip himself as a hoplite. And these are this Greek heavy spearmen that are famous from all the images that you see everywhere. So they have a big round double grip shield, which is made of wood, possibly with a bronze facing. It covers a large part of your body. It's very protective. It's very good in these kind of close combat situations where you need to have that head to toe kind of protection, or it's like it's knee to shoulder essentially. It covers you. And then they have body armor as well. So they have these big helmets. Some of them cover the entire face. Lighter types have also come into use, but most of these still have this sort of cheek guards to make sure the entire head and face is protected. They might wear a cuirass, which could be made of bronze. Others are sort of composite organic materials. But they're fully armored, head, chest, and possibly even greaves on the legs as well to cover the bit that sticks out under the shield. So they're very heavily armored, and their offensive weapon is this long spear, which is a thrusting spear. It's not meant for throwing at this point anymore. They've sort of gone out, focused completely on this close combat type of armament. It's a rear-weighted spear, which means you have a lot of reach forward. It's very easy to handle in order to thrust quite precisely in front of you with a reach of about perhaps 1.5 meters or 2 meters ahead of where you're standing.
So much further than someone who's holding a knife or a sword or something like that.
Exactly.
So you've got this wall of wood and metal and these shields, and in between that you're thrusting out these long spears.
That's right. In this period, we're not exactly sure what this kind of infantry combat looked like, because the famous phalanx formation, where they form these quite dense, regular formations of ranks and files, that seems to still be emerging from the experience, to some extent the experience of the Persian Wars, where they realized that kind of massed heavy infantry was very effective. They might have been a little bit more sort of messy shield walls, but fundamentally that is what they are. They are block formations that consist entirely of these guys who are armed purely for close combat, and who either very aggressively charge into the enemy to make it their problem, or they try to hold positions by sort of passively forming these quite heavily armored bulwarks of shields locked together.
And the Persians?
So the Persians, I mean,
obviously vast array of different types.
Huge array of different types, and this is kind of where it becomes difficult to say. There are hoplites on the Persian side. I mean, especially with some of the territories they've just conquered, they would have been recruiting them immediately. And we hear this about after the Battle of Thermopylae. Immediately, wherever they march, they will just say, "Okay, you're in this army now. You owe your military service to the king." Hoplites are also there, and there are people from all over this empire that fight in ways similar to hoplites. There are Assyrian heavy spearmen, there are Babylonians and Egyptians, there are Carians, Lycians, Cilicians, Phoenicians, Cypriots. They all just fight in ways that are very recognizable to the Greeks. Then the Persians themselves, though, and this is kind of the encounter that we're always interested in, this kind of facing off of cultures. The Persians themselves, we're told they fight with very large tower shields made of wicker. So they set down these shields in these sort of shield walls, the unbroken walls. And from behind that shield wall, they actually initially fight with arrows. So they use bow and arrow to kind of unleash a barrage of arrows onto their enemies. But if it does come to close combat, if they have to fight for the shield wall, then the spears and the short swords and axes come out. They don't seem to wear helmets, which is a very odd one. Even Persian cavalry doesn't seem to wear helmets. It seems to be just a cultural choice. They just don't do that. Other peoples of the area do wear helmets, but the Persians don't. They just wear sort of cloth headdresses, something like a turban or a covering for the head. And then their bodies seem to be, at least with the elite Persian troops, they are protected by scale armor. So they're wearing these suits of iron scales. They're called fish scales, essentially.
There's no sort of technological advantage in the kit that's being worn and used by the Greeks at this point.
Herodotus kind of makes a point here that the Greek armor is superior, that their shields are better, or that they have these big shields, whereas the Persians, because they set down their shields and fight behind them, don't actually have them to protect themselves in individual combat. Once that shield wall, that Persian shield was thrown down, the Persians don't have the same level of individual protection. That doesn't actually come up in the Thermopylae narrative. It comes up in Plataea quite a bit, where the Greeks are actually much more aggressive. At Thermopylae, because the Persians are the ones who are attacking, this kind of problem doesn't seem to arise. But he does mention that the Persians have shorter spears, and this does get in their way. So what they end up having to do in close combat is having to seize Greek spears and try to snap them off, and try to break them with their hands, just so that they can even the playing field. And that obviously puts you at a huge disadvantage.
We're getting very close to the fighting beginning now. There's a whole bunch of stories about various heroic pronouncements are made by Leonidas and the Greeks. Are these just later Greek authors making things up, having fun, celebrating?
Everything we know about this battle is Spartan propaganda, right? We don't have any kind of sober factual account. We have Herodotus trying his best to get at something like the truth from the story that he has, but this is all Spartan propaganda. And so there are loads of stories that are attached to this, which he's very happy to tell because he loves a good story, which essentially are trying to portray the Spartans as this incredible manifestation of the human will, of courage and selflessness and sacrifice. And so there's all sorts of stories that kind of bear this out, right? There's the famous story that the Persians are baffled when they see the Spartans preparing for battle by oiling and combing their hair, and they're sort of exercising in the nude, and they're doing all these things, and they have to wonder, they have to ask, their own sort of pet Spartan king, Demaratus, who fled to the Persian court. So he's there to ask questions if you need. And Xerxes has to ask him, like, what are they doing? And he says, this is just what Spartans do before battle. They get ready by, beautifying themselves, making themselves look as best they can because they know they're preparing to meet a glorious end. And these kinds of anecdotes really sort of drive home this point that the Spartans are almost superhumanly indifferent to the horrors that they're about to face and to the likely death that awaits them.
And subsequent generations, right down to the present day, we have been willing participants in that propaganda. We eat it up.
Love those stories. In fact, some of those stories that come from much later authors that Herodotus doesn't even feature have been glorified in all these, in movies and retellings and all sorts, where, the Persians send them a message, according to a later source, Diodorus, send them a letter saying, surrender your weapons, at which point Leonidas responds with a letter saying, come and get them. This is a slogan that gets used all over the world to show defiance against authority, and especially, in the United States, this is a slogan for people who, want to protect the individual's right to bear arms. They will quote this because they don't want some kind of despotic power telling them to hand over their weapons. But these stories are all essentially fictional embellishments in order to try and establish just how indifferent the Spartans are to the impossible odds that they face.
So the Persians have waited in vain for their fleet to arrive. They've made the decision they're going to try and take this position head on. What do we know about it? What happens? How does the fighting begin?
So it's actually very hard to know because the account that we do have, as I said, is basically propaganda. And it's very tainted by this desire of the Spartans to portray themselves, these perfect hoplite warriors, right? They want to go out and fight the enemy in the field, in the open, one-to-one. The problem is Thermopylae isn't a kind of terrain that really permits that. So you're in this position where they have fortified the pass, they're holding the wall. Perhaps some of those troops are standing in front of the wall to kind of create a barrier, to create a sallying position. But fundamentally, this isn't a field battle, and hoplites don't get to come into their own in these kinds of situations. They're much more passive than they normally would be, and they don't really get to choose how the enemy engages them if they're just holding a position, right? So the Persians get to choose how they fight.
We call this the Great Battle of Thermopylae. In a way, it's almost a bit of a siege.
It is very much, yeah. So this is a positional battle over a fortification, essentially, at least while it's happening in the pass. And so even though all of our sources say that what the Persians did was immediately throw thousands or even 10,000 troops at this position and straight into, this huge mass of troops straight into close combat. This actually doesn't square with what we hear about Persian behavior elsewhere. So when we get accounts of how they fight at the Battle of Plataea and later the Battle of Mycale, what we hear about is that they set down the shield wall and then start peppering the enemy with arrows. So this is much more passive, meticulous, procedural approach to battle, right? They set down that shield wall, they start firing arrows. The enemy has to either take it or be pulled out of their position in order to fight at a disadvantage. The Persians tried this at Marathon against the Athenians. It didn't work just because the Athenians were so aggressive. They didn't have the time to really make their arrows count. But at Thermopylae, if the Spartans stand and hold that position and don't do anything, the Persians most likely would have taken that same approach and said, well, if you're just going to stand there, we're just going to bury you in arrows. This is the famous quote that this Spartan, that's attached to this Spartan, right, Leonidas, who supposedly said when he was warned that the Persian arrows would blot out the sun, he said, well, that's actually really nice because that means we'll get to fight in the shade. It's very hot in summer, obviously. I was there last summer, it was 40 degrees or something. You absolutely don't want to stand in the open, so you definitely have respect for Leonidas saying that. Seems rational for the Persians not to engage in all-out assault, but rather to weaken this position from a distance because there's nothing much that the Greeks could do about that. So the story that we're told in the sources is that first they send the Medes and the Kissians, two of the Iranian peoples that are under their sway. They send them in first to kind of probe the position. Most likely this was essentially just done with missiles, but according to the sources, it's actually just a head-on assault. They get right into the thick of it with the hoplites, and obviously they get nowhere.
So you can imagine if the hoplites are manning the battlement of this wall, there's people with ladders, there's people trying to scale that wall.
There's many more Greeks present than you need to hold that very narrow position.
They might be in front of the wall.
So what they do is they rotate who stands in front of
Yeah.
the wall and is bearing the brunt of the fighting. So they take turns. The different contingents are taking turns. And so in one version of the story, which is much more focused on Spartan propaganda, we're told that the Spartans basically do all of this and the rest of the Greeks are just kind of watching them do it. But in Herodotus, which is the much more likely account, they are taking turns, moving fresh troops in, letting others take a rest, going through in phases to make sure that the Persians can't actually reach the wall and start doing the siege warfare, which they're very good at, because that is a strength of the Persian military.
The more I read about history, the more I'm convinced that rotation is not talked about enough in ancient sources or medieval sources, because after a minute of fighting hand to hand in heavy armour, you are absolutely knackered, especially in that sun.
In the heat, yeah, absolutely.
The idea you're
You
going to do it for hours at a time
water,
is absurd, right? So I think there's this penguins moving in and out the middle of the huddle to stay warm. They must be constant. They must have been very familiar with this sort of movement between ranks.
What we actually normally get in these Greek encounters is that you don't actually see rotation. You see battles being decided very quickly. So actually what happens is they don't try to figure out a way to get fresh troops back in. They just try to get this battle over and done with as soon as possible. So what's actually really unique about Thermopylae is that the fighting goes on for 2 straight days. And what that actually looks like on the ground, we just don't know. I mean, it seems implied that there's a constant ongoing grind of close combat, but that makes it impossible that the Spartans could have withdrawn from that, essentially sort of pulled themselves out of an ongoing melee in order to be replaced by other forces that are funneling through a narrow gate in this wall to take up their position. Much more likely that actually we're talking about a very tentative engagement, possibly most of it at range, at which point sometimes these troops could sort of fall back, hopefully in a somewhat orderly fashion, in order to be replaced by fresh forces that could then take their position relatively unmolested and try again to maintain that stand.
Yeah, because from the other side of it, the Persians, to assume it's just constant, it would mean like putting something into a wood chipper, and then somehow you're just getting piles of corpses over which the next Persian's having to constantly attack, and that feels physically impossible as well.
It feels almost like a caricature of an ancient battle, right? I mean, you do have occasions where the dead pile up in ancient warfare. If there's a compression of forces, most of the time when they're trying to run away but they can't escape and then they all get killed in place. That doesn't seem to happen here. We don't have any mention of that. We don't have heaps of corpses or anything like that. What we seem to see is, I mean, these people don't go anywhere, which is one reason to assume that they're actually not taking that many losses. They're actually not in a constant grind. They're actually sort of trying to take their distance and probing each other's position. So you're getting some of this narrative, which we hear about, that the Spartans are able to perform these kind of skirmishing attacks. They will launch themselves forward, then seem to retreat, tearing the Persians out of their formation in pursuit, and then turn around and kill the ones that are pursuing them. So these are the kind of tactic that we have to imagine. It's both of them forming a more or less passive shield wall, trying to hurt each other with missiles, trying to ward each other off, but then every now and then obviously someone will try to disrupt that, try to pull the other out, try to get them to expose themselves, try to get them to be vulnerable, and then to strike at whatever they can catch.
It's stalemate, but it's not stalemate because the whole field is covered with corpses and they're now fighting on corpses 3 deep.
I mean, that is just never an impression that we get. I mean, obviously Herodotus likes to say, oh, the numbers that he hears about the dead. He hears about 1,000 Persian dead, and he thinks this number is too low. He doesn't believe it. And so he says, oh, it must be because they hid the rest of them. So he supposes that Xerxes made a big mass grave and buried the rest of the dead in there and hid it from sight, and then everybody else got to see only the 1,000 that he allowed them generously to behold. But actually, if you imagine that this is quite a tentative fight, that number of 1,000 sounds
feels
plausible.
about right.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we think that's what it's like for the whole of these first 2 days. Just the Persians coming and going like the sort of tide, and sometimes close, as you say, skirmishes breaking out, groups getting isolated, champions perhaps taunting each other and maybe fighting. But on the whole, not 2 great presses of men absolutely in a sort of climactic melee.
There may have been times when this happened, right? So there's definitely moments in the fighting, especially later on in the final day, when we do hear of what's called othismos, the pushing, which is a very strange thing that happens in some battle accounts in Greek warfare, in which it seems like these armies are indeed getting into an absolute scrum over a particular situation. And in a narrow pass like that, it may well have happened that when one side surges forward but the other side refuses to back down, that you get these moments of crush. But they would have been temporary, and obviously you have to imagine the front line is very narrow, so the number of people who can actually physically get involved in this kind of thing is quite small. So you end up having perhaps locally quite extreme casualties, but then that is a moment in a wider narrative in which only a very small part of the army can really engage at a time. And so first it's the Medes and the Kissians wearing themselves out. They don't get anywhere. At the end of that same day, Xerxes decides, okay, I'm going to send my elite troops in. And these are the immortals who form the second wave. And they try the same thing, but they also don't get anywhere.
Xerxes must have been very frustrated by that. Is that partly a reflection just of this very odd defensive landscape? Or does it really show that there's something in the Greek way of war that's particularly effective?
Any army that has tried to hold the pass at Thermopylae has initially succeeded because the terrain is just that welcoming to a defender. It's really basically just a narrow pass. All you have to do is make sure that you block it effectively. Of course, hoplites are very much the kind of warrior who stands their ground or even aggressively advances on the enemy. So in that sense, it's a beautiful combination in a way. If the roles were reversed and the Persians were holding the pass against the Greeks, I would imagine the outcome would be much the same. Okay. It's the position that you're trying to break into. And of course, as long as you have a very small number of people actually engaged, then you can infinitely refresh that front line and make sure that the enemy has no way of getting through.
So the elite immortals have been sent in. Tell me about those immortals. What makes them so elite?
So this is essentially the Persian core of this army, right? These are Xerxes' infantry guard. They're a unit that's really quite hazily attested in the sense that Herodotus has quite a lot to say about them, but then they disappear from the source, right? They never appear ever again. Alexander never meets them. They seem to just stop existing as a unit or something. We don't really know what happens with them. But in this campaign, they're very prominent. The Athanatoi, they're called the Immortals, according to Herodotus, because there was a standing rule that if any of them died, they would be immediately replaced. They're drawn from the Persian nobility, so they're supposed to be really socially and politically elite, as well as being something of a standing force. So there are 10,000 of these archer spearmen who form the Persian core of an otherwise multi-ethnic army.
So they don't get through either.
We're explicitly told that it goes no better than it does with the others. I mean, there's very much just the same result because, again, the position combined with the resolve of the Greeks and their equipment means that it's simply not penetrable by head-on assault.
And in this period, you can't fight at night?
Famously, there's the 300 version where this all happens at night. Night fighting is a feature of ancient warfare, and certainly in the Greek world there's a couple of prominent examples of it, but it's generally avoided for the very good reason that night fighting is extremely difficult. I mean, it's very likely to result in chaos, confusion, and panic. So it's a very risky undertaking to try and fight anyone at night. So most of what is likely to have happened is that at some point when it got dark, fighting often stops, fighting breaks off. And troops obviously will still be holding their positions, they will be on watch for any kind of surprise move, but as long as you're not trying to either sort of steal a march on someone or surprise someone or take advantage of terrain you know really well, you wouldn't really attack an army at night. That is likely to happen in the first night of this battle, is that the armies just separate. The Persians have quite a march ahead of them to get back to their camp, which is miles away, and they wait for morning to try again.
They'll vacate the battlefield, the Persians. They'll head off.
Yes, well, they will presumably have some people watching to make sure the Greeks aren't making any funny moves, but otherwise, yes, this is something they entirely leave.
So the sun comes up. It's day 2. Similar vibe, day 2?
Similar vibe, yeah. So we're told that more troops get sent in of an uncertain identity. What we're told is that Xerxes picks the best troops out of all the nations of his army and throws them at the position to see basically what sticks. This is the time when we are allowed to imagine all these different kinds of troops encountering the Spartans but still getting nowhere.
And all fighting perhaps in slightly different ways, slightly different weapons.
Exactly. So we've been told about all the way that they're equipped, and obviously it's easy to kind of embellish this further and start talking about all sorts of exotic figures and animals and all sorts that might have been involved in this. In reality, these seem to have all been infantry fighting to a greater or lesser degree in close combat. Many of them would have been missile troops specializing in archery or javelin throwing. And Xerxes is essentially trying to send whatever he has and see which one of any of them is having greater success than the troops he tried the previous day.
It's really interesting. It does show that with the right defensive geography, just the heavily armed hoplite with a big shield and a long spear and well protected is pretty immovable.
It's a situation that suits their strength ideally, right? As long as they are able to maintain the defensive position and they don't get overwhelmed by missiles. They are taking serious losses in this. The stories that the Spartans are hardly losing anyone, I think, are very exaggerated. What's likely happening is that they are suffering quite a bit from the arrows, as they do later at the Battle of Plataea. Many of them will have been receiving wounds, possibly even being killed by this constant rain of arrows that's being unleashed on them. Again, the sources don't talk about this because the Spartan propaganda story makes this into a hoplite fight. So they focus exclusively on the idea that the Spartans are obviously dominant in close combat. But it does seem like obviously the combination of the geography, the determination and the equipment here in the Spartan and the other Greeks as well, who are faring just as well as the Spartans in this fight when they have their turn. It doesn't seem to be something that the Persians can overcome by brute force.
Interesting. As you say, their best chance is probably just that aerial bombardment, unending, eventually will attrit those defending forces. As we learned in the First World War, it's that kind of indirect fire that just is eventually breaks through.
Although there's a couple of really famous later examples of where hoplites' armies are just demolished by light troops, and this is usually because they're caught in the open.
Yeah.
So if you can surround them and you keep your distance from them, so you prevent them from coming into their own by meeting you head on, you keep yourself at a distance, but you discharge your missiles whenever you have an opportunity, from whichever flank, whichever side you can get on, then these hoplites, firstly, they're going to lose hard because they know they can't do anything to you and they're suffering losses, so their morale plummets, and eventually they will just break and scatter because there's just nothing they can do.
Lumbering towards some water source or something,
Essentially, and being ultimately overrun. But in this position, of course, there is no way to really outflank this force, so they are able to stand there with their shields up, and a lot of what happens then is not going to harm them all that much. So in order for these light troops to have a real chance against these heavily armored forces, you really need a lot more open terrain, you need a lot more mobility, and the Persians are kind of stumped by the fact that they are just up against this wall. Essentially, they're in this very narrow place.
Well, you need to turn their flank. And that brings us to the next phase of the battle. What happens next?
The problem with the pass of Thermopylae is, while it's very strong if you're holding it head on, it has one critical weakness, which is that it can be turned. There's a path over the mountain that overlooks this pass.
There's always a path.
And if you know the path, then you can come round and end up in the rear of this position that's very defensible. And of course, at that point, any defender has had it. And this is consistent throughout history, that anybody who holds that pass has to also worry about the path that goes around it, because it is the way that you nullify the advantage.
You can imagine armies in the future reading Herodotus and going, bloody hell, there's a mountain path we've got to defend as well.
Well, but the Greeks knew it as well, of course. I mean, it's not something that they would have been sort of surprised by. In fact, when the Greek allies under Leonidas arrive at the pass, he immediately sends the Phocians, so the local population who know this terrain very well, he sends them to guard this path. He says, you guys know where this is going, hold that position to cover our flank, and we will hold the space down here together with the Peloponnesians and everybody else. They know that this is a vulnerability, and they prepared for it. But the problem is that when the Persians find out, this is something that either they're told by a local shepherd, or more likely they're just told by their Thessalian allies who have used this way to get around Thermopylae before. So they have people in their army who can tell them, like, this is how you do it.
But you mentioned a shepherd there. There's the famous, infamous Ephialtes, who is perhaps someone who shows. Is that something that's just made up?
Well, so we don't know. Obviously, that's the story that Herodotus tells, is that it was this local shepherd from Malis or Trachis, one of these regions that are local to this area. Somebody who knew these mountains, who went to Xerxes and asked, for a reward if you could sort of give him this intel. And that is a story that seems to have had enough weight for Herodotus to say that later on the Spartans actually tried to find this guy to have him assassinated for his treason, essentially. So there definitely is something of a backstory there where they wanted to pin it on this one guy. But I think modern historians increasingly feel like, you don't really need that. You have to imagine that Xerxes, throughout the narrative, even throughout the way that Herodotus presents him, he's always asking questions. He's always asking everyone, okay, why are they doing this? What are these people like? How do they fight? What do they do? What are they going to do if I do this? And he's constantly asking, for instance, Demaratus, whom we've already met, this Spartan king who's in his court and who's traveling with him. He's always asking him questions about the Spartans and to figure out what these people are like. So it's very hard to imagine that when he takes Thessaly, which he's just done, that he wouldn't start asking these people, right, so you've dealt with this situation before. Thessalians and Phocians hate each other's guts. They've always been at war. They've been at war recently. The Thessalians know how to get around this pass. It'd be absurd to imagine that Xerxes wouldn't, or one of his advisors, one of his generals, wouldn't at some point have taken some of these Thessalians aside and said, look, how do you deal with this? Like, what is the story with this pass? And obviously they would have told him, because if it gets them to do something horrible to the Phocians, they love that. They send these immortals at night to go over this position. Again, you might march at night if you're trying to, surprise an enemy. They send them up this path, and they encounter the Phocians up there. But the Phocians don't resist. So the immortals are getting ready to fight them. They're starting to shoot some arrows at them, and the Phocians just kind of draw back and let them pass. And the immortals can't believe their luck, obviously. They're just like, well, we thought this was going to be really difficult, but you're letting it happen. Fair enough. There is a possibility that the Phocians may have made some kind of arrangement with the Persians and agreed to allow them to pass in exchange for sort of lenient treatment of the territory that would have fallen under their sway afterwards. We don't really know what happened there, but fundamentally the Phocians don't do their job. And so the immortals get to proceed onwards, and eventually, when morning breaks, they are coming down the path in strength behind the allied Greek position.
At that stage, everything changes.
The position is untenable, essentially. I mean, there's no two ways about it. I mean, if the Greeks end up being surrounded, then that point I made earlier about the use of missiles starts to become a real problem for them, because then they're facing that barrage from two sides. They won't be able to protect themselves effectively. They're doomed.
They can't receive reinforcements or food or anything.
as long as the Persians can hold, the next pass over and prevent anything from reaching them. But this is already the point where the Leonidas knows that no one else is coming, right? He's already been told that those reinforcements can't be sent, and so they won't arrive. And so the question is, what do we do next? There's two options available to Leonidas. One is obviously to stay, and one is to retreat. What seems to happen is he tells the allies to retreat, so all of the troops with him who've come from all the different cities to support him there, he tells them, just go home. The alternative version is that they just flee and he doesn't have the chance to even tell them. But fundamentally, they leave, they melt away, which is very much what Xerxes had in mind initially. This is the best way to clear a pass, is without even fighting at all, just sort of threatening it in such a way that people have to give up the position. So all the allies flee with a few exceptions, but Leonidas decides that he should stay and keep his position, even if it means being surrounded and facing death.
So why does he do that?
It's an excellent question. We have several different versions of why he does that.
Is it the oracle? Does he know he has to die?
So that's obviously one of the reasons that the Spartans put out, is that he knew he had to die anyway. It was foretold, and so he was fulfilling his role. That was essentially what he was trying to do. Herodotus mentions that reason last, and it's almost like an afterthought. He's almost like, okay, well, that may have been a factor as well. It's certainly a story I've heard. But he seems to privilege other reasons why Leonidas did this. One of them, which, recently Matthew Sears has a great book about this where he emphasized this, is just Leonidas wanted glory. He thought that this was something that was fit, fitting for a Spartan king to fight to the death, kill as many Persians as he could. That's something that Herodotus puts very front and center. Leonidas was out for the glory of his name. The other thing is that he thought that it was wrong for him to abandon a position that he had been ordered by the ephors to hold. So obviously the kings at Sparta are not all-powerful. They don't have this sort of autocratic power. They are subject to this executive council called the Ephorid. And the ephors told him to go with this force, and so if they told him to hold Thermopylae, he could not possibly disobey the law, disobey the directive that he was given, and abandon the position at Thermopylae. And I think there's definitely something there about how you assess the personality of Leonidas, like what kind of person you think he was. It's very interesting to know that he's a very old man. He's about 60 at this point because he's only the third eldest son, so he had to wait for a long time before he could actually ascend the throne. He never expected to. And he's only been in power for about 10 years, and he doesn't seem to have any military experience. We don't know of any campaign he's fought before. He may have participated in campaigns under the rule of his half-brother, but he hasn't led an army before. And so it's always been my sense that Leonidas is quite uncertain about what he's supposed to do in this situation, right? Like what a commander should do, what a general should do, what a Spartan king should do. When he doesn't know how to resolve the situation, like, oh no, if I retreat from this position, much of Greece will be lost. I will have failed in my mission. I will have to go home and say, sorry, I couldn't do the thing you asked me to do. It wouldn't be the first time that a Spartan king is taken to trial, exiled, or even executed at home for failing to meet the expectations of the Spartans. And so he may have thought, you know what, there's only one thing I can really do that is fitting for my role, which is to just stay and fight, even if it means dying. This is one thing that certainly no one can ever question. This is absolutely the moral thing to do.
And if he was thinking in terms of the reputation of Sparta, it was one of the best calls ever made on the battlefield, because nearly 2,500 years later, people are still enthralled to this myth of the indestructible Spartans.
Absolutely. So in terms of strategy, there's absolutely no sense to this. It's often been explained away as a rearguard action, right? He's protecting the troops that are retreating. The fact is, the Persians don't seem to do anything to pursue those troops. They just turn inward and try to clear the pass. That's what they spend the day doing. And then they have quite a bit of time afterwards when they're just kind of mopping up. So there isn't really any attempt to pursue this army. And it's really unlikely that Leonidas thought of this as a rearguard action meant to delay the Persians to prevent them from getting at the allies who were retreating and going home. So this is really just a retroactive justification. This is a decision that seems to have been made entirely, as Herodotus suggests, on the basis of calculations of what was the right thing for a Spartan to do and what was the right thing for a Spartan army to do. Whether it had to do with the oracle or with the orders of the ephors or anything else, that is what's going on here. At this point, the best they can probably do strategically is save the rest of the army by going home and fighting another day. But instead he chooses to fight. That has no military merit, but obviously it is the story that we tell because it is this story of the decision to say, I don't care what the odds are, I don't care if I die, this is the mission and I am fulfilling it.
So the other Greeks, they melt away, they leave, they march south. Is it just the Spartans that stay?
Different sources give different accounts, which is very annoying. According to some sources, just the Spartans, but they give unrealistic numbers. Other sources actually add other contingents that are also there. So potentially even the Perioikoi who are there, who Herodotus doesn't mention, the other Lacedaemonians essentially might have stayed as well. We don't really know. Certainly the 300 Spartiates, or however many are left at this point. The Thespians, who are from a small town in Boeotia, are also sticking around. And the Thebans, who may or may not have joined voluntarily. This is a contested issue in the ancient sources for various complex propaganda reasons. Those three contingents we know about. And then a very late source, Pausanias, mentions that the Mycenaeans, who only have about 80 hoplites at this battle, because they're a very small and insignificant town at this point.
The once mighty Mycenaeans.
The once mighty Mycenaeans, who have 80 hoplites in the game, and they supposedly also stayed and died with Leonidas.
Oh, spoiler alert there, lads. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
That's fine.
In case you didn't know what happened, the Battle of Thermopylae. Yeah.
So the Persians, do we know about how this last attack goes down? They're now approaching from north and south, the Spartans attempting to defend both sides of this wall?
Again, two different versions of this. One, which is the big Spartan propaganda legend, which says that they didn't actually wait till morning and wait for the Persians to come down. What they did was in the night, when they heard about the immortals were coming down the mountain, they decided, okay, right, let's up and go, cross the bay, sort of march alongside outside the series of passes at Thermopylae and attack the Persian camp to see if we can kill Xerxes. That's this sort of commando mission in which this legend ends. But Herodotus makes a sort of weird mix of that and the more realistic actual end of this story, where he says they actually marched out beyond the Phocian wall, so out into the open to fight the Persians. And then when Leonidas died in that fight, they retreated back into the wall and moved to a small hill, the Kolonos Hill, which is still there, in order to make their final stand. The problem with that, obviously, is that when you march out into the open, all the Persian strengths come into their own. So you're putting yourself at a massive disadvantage for absolutely no reason whatsoever. It would make much more sense for them to stick to their wall and keep on fighting as they have until the Persians in their rear show up, and then to find some way to kind of double up on themselves to make a sort of serious stand. That is more likely to be what actually happened. It's just that for the propaganda story to work, of course, this needs to be a big hoplite battle. Leonidas needs to have died heroically, spear in hand, facing the Persians. And so, for a lot of reasons, this is the story that we've ended up with, where they actually march out from their perfect defensive position in order to meet the Persians where they are for essentially no reason whatsoever. What does seem to be very likely, because of the position of an ancient monument on this hill, this Kolonos Hill, is that that is where they made their final stand. So eventually, when the Persians, when the immortals appear in their rear, they withdrew from the wall up onto this hillock, making presumably some kind of circle or box formation and waiting for the end.
And so actually the fighting on that final day may have been quite similar to the fighting in the 2 days before, which was lines approaching each other, throwing missiles, shooting arrows,
probing,
and then finally that attrition just breaking down the Spartans.
There is a lot of fighting over the body of Leonidas, supposedly, although we have to be very suspect of this because the narrative feels very Homeric. It feels very much like the fighting over the body of Patroclus and things like that, where you're just like, there's a body on the field and you have to make this tight mass to protect the body and make sure the enemy can't grab it and despoil it. So you have this fighting over the body, which is where we encounter that word othismos that I mentioned earlier. So there's a pushing between the two sides, masses of heavy infantry fighting over this precious resource, the body of Leonidas that's on the ground. He dies in the fighting, his men recover his body, and we're told that's when they retreat to the hill, presumably carrying the dead Leonidas with them to make their final stand. And that's where we finally hear that it was missiles that brought them down. The Persians surround them on all sides and just bury them in arrows. And that is how the story ends.
There's enough arrows, enough slinging rocks, you're gonna find ways through.
Well, any player who's ever encountered a noob box in Rome Total War knows you aim for the back of the unit on the other side of the box, not the one directly in front of you. No, but this is fundamentally the tactic, obviously, is that you throw this mass of arrows and that you can't protect yourself on all sides. Eventually, that constant rain of missiles is going to count.
So we think sometime on that third day, the final Spartan was cut down. Does anyone survive?
So there's one survivor. Well, there's actually two survivors. There's actually three survivors. Okay, this is a complex story. Herodotus keeps adding more people that he said, actually, this one also got away. There's two survivors who get sent away from the battle because they have an eye infection. And so they're ill, they're wounded, essentially, they're walking wounded, they can't fight. But one of them decides that actually, no, he wants to join in this glorious sacrifice of the Spartans. So he says to his helot attendant, which is one of the moments when we find out all these helots are also here, presumably
everyone's got a servant with
having
them.
Absolutely no choice and being condemned to die by their enslavers, which is not great. This guy says, he says to his helot, just point me in the direction of the Persians. And he sort of marches in blind and gets killed. And for that reason, the other one, Aristodemus, who does go home to Sparta with his eye infection and eventually recovers, gets shamed by all Spartans because he didn't live up to the ideal that the other one who's in the exact same situation did. For various reasons, a couple of other Spartans managed to get away from this, but they all come to ignominious ends because, and one of them ends up taking his own life because they can't face the shame of being the only survivors of this battle. And so what happens with Aristodemus in particular, he gets subject to these laws they have in Sparta for those who run away from battle because he's proclaimed a coward and he has to face all sorts of social ostracism. When he's in the army again at the Battle of Plataea the next year, that drives him to essentially commit suicide by Persian. He charges out alone against the Persian line and gets killed, just because he wanted to prove that, oh no, actually he was just as brave as the other Spartans and he was willing to die for the Spartan ideal. And so that is absolutely one of those moments where the Spartan ideal forces them to behave in a way that initially might seem, senseless to us. I mean, he wasn't well, he could just go home, that's obviously fine. For them, this was this huge moment of like, prove yourself to be true to your creed, prove yourself to be true to the rest of the Spartans that died at Thermopylae.
Leonidas is dead. The Spartans have been killed almost to a man. So what kind of casualties do you think we're talking about then?
So Herodotus says 4,000 Greek casualties, but that number seems way too high. I mean, that would have meant that about half of the armor, or even more, was just wiped out, when in fact most of them seem to have gotten away. So we're talking about those that stayed behind, so the 300 Spartans, perhaps the 1,000 Spartans, plus however many Thespians there were, which can't have been that many because of the size of the communities, it's just not that big. And then all of the losses that were inflicted in the course of 2 days of fighting, which is just unknown. But I think a more realistic estimate would be somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 altogether.
As you said earlier, perhaps only 1,000 Persian casualties.
I think that's quite a realistic figure. I mean, this is, compared to the other engagements of the Persian Wars, this is quite a relatively small one, and that's entirely just because of the geographic confines. There just isn't that much violence you can inflict on a battle line in such a narrow space.
So the road to the south is open. What happens next? Briefly sum it up.
Briefly, Central Greece is lost. Basically means there is no other geographical position in which you could easily stop an invading army. The Greeks know this, which means that the Spartans' next defensive position is at the isthmus, which I mentioned, so north of Corinth, which means that everything north of there, Phocis, Locris, Boeotia, and Athens, are essentially taken by the Persians. Those places which had sent contingents to resist at Thermopylae are brutally sacked. Athens is taken, they evacuate the city, flee to Salamis and to some places on the Peloponnese, flee to their ships, at which point the city is taken by the Persians and razed to the ground. So this is quite a significant regional advance and a major victory for the Persians. And
we should check in with the Navy, because that fleet, the Allied fleet that was sort of holding the flank of the army at Thermopylae, as the Allies have retreated from Thermopylae, the fleet's also retreated back round effectively to Salamis, where those Athenians are.
So during the fighting, Thermopylae is obviously the story of a Spartan defeat, but the fleet has managed to hold its own. So it's basically fought the Persian fleet to a standstill. But when they hear that Leonidas is dead and the force has been scattered, they are forced to retreat, because then at that point they can be outflanked from the landward side. So they have to withdraw that fleet. And so the Athenians who produced the bulk of that fleet obviously withdraw to Athens to start evacuating the city, and the other allied contingents are kind of hanging around trying to seek strength in numbers. This fleet is still together at the time when the Persians are taking Athens. And it's the Athenians who are really pushing for another decisive engagement to try and essentially recover some of what they've lost. I mean, they've lost their entire territory at this point. They obviously want to see some kind of decisive action against the Persians to try and undo that. So they are really pushing. But the problem is the Athenians, even though they provide half of all the ships in this alliance, they are not in command. In order to get the Spartans on board, they had to accept that the Spartans were going to be commanders on land and on the sea, even though the Spartans only have 16, 17 ships at Salamis and the Athenians have 180. This is basically just the way in which the Spartans assert themselves over this alliance. So the Spartans are in charge, doesn't matter where, also on the sea, even though they don't care about the sea, they don't care about naval power, they're in charge, they are leading. And they resist this, so they actually want to withdraw everything to the Peloponnese. And the Athenians really have to pull out all the stops.
A couple of dirty tricks, maybe.
Exactly. So Themistocles, famously, is the Athenian naval commander, has to both use all of his persuasive power and all of his sort of cajoling of all the various other allies, but also has to essentially trick the Persians into attacking in order to force the Greeks to stay and fight at the Battle of Salamis.
And Salamis is a great, crushing naval victory for the Greeks. So that means that by the end of this year, this fateful year 480, Where are we?
So it's a weird balance has been reached in the sense that the Persian fleet, although it's not destroyed, I mean, the Greek allies actually suspected that the day after Salamis they'd come and fight again, but they didn't. They withdraw. So they withdraw across the Aegean, and the Persian fleet is essentially no longer a factor. It has to go and sort of go to Asia Minor and lick its wounds. At which point the Greeks are free to operate on the sea however they want, but on land the Persians are in Attica, right? The Persians are all the way down to the Isthmus of Corinth. They advance into the Megarid. They are about to end the last sort of remains of Greek resistance. But of course, that's the end of the campaign season. And in most of the wars of the ancient world, there's no campaigning in winter. So the Persians actually withdraw way north of Thermopylae even. They withdraw into Thessaly to spend the winter there in sort of winter quarters, essentially. They build an encampment and spend some months doing not much at all. At which point, when they come back, march south again into Boeotia, take Athens again, burn it down again for good measure. At that point, a new campaign season has begun, and there's still all to play for because the allies at this point have actually finally realized that with the victory at Salamis, with their hands free to operate, they can actually do things very differently. They can take a different approach to this invasion.
We'll do it another time on another show, but there's a massive battle at Plataea, the unsung hero of the Greco-Persian battles, at which the Greeks decisively win.
At Thermopylae, everybody was complaining that there weren't enough Spartans, and this is the problem that the Spartans desperately had to fix with their propaganda story about why they sent so few men. The next year, they finally send their full levy to Plataea, and they order all of their subject allies to send everyone they can. So this is a huge army. This is one of the largest armies of hoplites ever assembled, meets the Persian army in Boeotia, where the land is more level and where the Persians have chosen to fight because they could get to play out their trump card of their cavalry and their mobile forces. And that is where the decisive battle happens, which ends in an absolute Greek victory, allied Greek victory, at which point the Persian army in Greece is effectively destroyed and the Greeks can start thinking about what they want to do now that the Persians are driven out of their lands.
Does this Greco-Persian Wars, for us, it's this founding event of of Western history, is that we get the first history book written in the European tradition, Herodotus here. We think this is this enormous, defining, world-changing event. Do you think it is? Do you think that traditional interpretation of the wars themselves, before we get to the battle, but the war itself, how important is it?
Well, it's a really interesting question. It really depends on whose side you look at it. I mean, for the Greeks, obviously, the way they told this story, this was a defining moment for them. As I mentioned before, it's even defining, in a literal sense of defining what it means to be Greek, is to be part of that coalition that fought off the Persians. And all the parties that were not in the coalition, all those states that decided to try and stay neutral or even submitted to the Persians, we hear later on that they tried to graft themselves onto the story. They build mounds with no dead in it, just to say we were there too. This is our mound on the battlefield of Plataea. You know, they all wanted to say that they were part of this glorious joint Greek resistance, which they weren't. This was a very sort of small number of allies who joined in this battle, but it was such a big story that they all wanted to be part of it. And for that, it is just a huge moment in history. But when we look at a big picture here, there's also a number of other peoples who've managed to ward off Persian invasions, right? The Ethiopians seem to have done it against Cambyses, the Massagetai against Cyrus the Great, the Scythians defeated Darius. So whenever these Persian kings seem to have extended themselves into lands that were beyond their territory, when they tried to push their expansion even further, eventually they would hit a wall. They would find peoples who were able to resist against them. The problem is we just don't have those stories. Otherwise, we might be singing praise in the same way of the Ethiopians resisting Cambyses or the Scythians resisting the forces of Darius in a similar sort of glorious and undefeated manner. But this is the story we have. And so it's important for the fact that it exists and for what it tells us about the ancient Greeks and how they started to see themselves. But in terms of the history of the Persian Empire, it's one of many episodes of the Persian might finding its limits, but not breaking, not becoming fatally weakened in any way. That Persian Empire persists for another 150 years, and it remains the superpower of the world. And the Greeks, in many ways, have to deal with this reality. They can't do anything to seriously destabilize the Persian Empire, and much more often than that, they end up relying on the Persians to help them in their own internal conflicts. So this is not an event that changes the map, essentially. This is just one of the many points at which the Persian Empire essentially establishes what its real limitations are, how far it can go, and then it starts to consolidate.
Of the battles we've described today, it strikes me that Thermopylae, in some ways, is the least important of those battles. Why is it the one that we talk about and celebrate and remember? Why are we making this YouTube film about the Battle of Thermopylae?
Well, it's entirely because it's a good story. Because, you know, in very sober terms, this is a fairly insignificant preliminary battle in which the Persians proved themselves more than up to the task of defeating Greek resistance. And that is fundamentally how they would have seen it, very likely. They marched into central Greece thinking, well, that went pretty well. It only delayed us for a few days, and we even killed one of their kings. So for Xerxes, this was a great day. For his army, this was a huge boost to their confidence, no doubt. And so for them, this is all fine. But the story that the Spartans started to tell in order to justify that what amounts to really a failure of leadership and a failure of strategic commitment, the story that they started to tell to try to cover that up ends up being one of the great tales of heroic resistance, you know, selfless sacrifice in the name of a greater good. And you do have to appreciate that some of those peoples, not just the Spartans, but also the Thespians, the Thebans, the Mycenaeans, they knew that death was coming. They knew they had no way out of that pass. And they still decided, you know what, we're just going to stick with that. We stand by our decision. We're going to fight to the death. So at some individual level, you can obviously appreciate people facing death with such pride and such sort of undaunted spirit, even if it was strategically meaningless, and even if there are better stories to be told if you're interested in how to fight off a Persian invasion.
Well, if you have to fight off Persian invasion, you will know what to do now. Roel, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking all about it, as ever. Roel is a star of ancient history. We've got many other shows of his on this YouTube channel, so please go and check them out. See you next time.